Welcome to Volendam, a village in the Netherlands about 20 kilometers away from Amsterdam, world famous for its traditional dress, its fishing history and its music. But it's also a village which has a very long and interesting history of Catholic tradition. That tradition goes back at least to the 1500s, and it will take us to Edam, the neighbouring city that had governed Volendam for a very long time. The footage that you're watching now was shot outside St. Vincent's Church in Volendam in the early 1930s. You will see that this small village, because it was only a small village in those days, had a very large Catholic population. Interesting, to say the least, because Volendam is the only place around the former Southern Sea that stayed true to Catholicism after the Reformation in the 1570s and has remained Catholic to this day. Because Volendam was such a small place, a fisherman's settlement under Edam government, it didn't have its own church, and the people of Volendam had to walk all the way to Edam to attend church services. The St. Vincent's Church behind me has come about after years, even decades, of the population of Volendam fighting for the right to build their own church. The reasons and the results of which still dividing the two towns today. So until Volendam eventually got their own church, the people had to go to church in Edam. As early as 1664, they went to different hidden churches, the last of which housed in what is now the garden of the current Holy Nicholas Church, where they kept attending Mass up to the mid-19th century. Now, that doesn't seem like a terrible obstacle, does it? I researched the path they took. Here, I'll show you. In the 21st century, on a sunny day, it seems like a nice walk. Now imagine the following. From the moment I crossed the yellow bridge and left the street in Volendam until I passed to the white gate-like bridge in the beginning of Edam, there would be absolutely nothing. Nothing to protect you from the wind and the rain, no paved roads, and of course, no street lights to light your ways in the dark times in winter. Pastor Hamraad of Edam wrote to a Catholic magazine in 1848, "Before 1843, the path was hardly accessible, particularly in winter and fall. The people had to plough through the knee-high mud of the farming fields, often with the men having to carry the women and the children. Not only the distance made the journey difficult, but also the hardship of crossing this distance on a path through the farming fields, crossing 24 ditches, loose planks and no banisters or support." Now it already took me slightly under 40 minutes to walk this route in, I must say, perfect weather conditions and on a very well maintained path. Just try and imagine what it must have been like walking this route in the times and conditions Pastor Hamraad wrote about. Or what if you suffered from bad health, eyesight or mobility? A justified question would be, why did no one try and improve the condition of this path for these people? Well, a large plot of land, the former Volendammer lake, a part of which we are overlooking from here, was the private property of one Dirk Wijting in 1838. Since he owned this land, he also owned the footpath that went over his dikes and which formed the only connection between Edam and Volendam. Dirk Wijting was not of bad will, and he didn't want to hinder the people of Edam and Volendam to use this path. Yet he feels that it's the city council's responsibility to maintain it. He sends the council a letter in which he urgently asks for the path to be hardened with rubble. In 1842, the pastor of Edam and the church wardens again asked the city council to maintain the path. As a result, in 1842, the path was enhanced, as we could hear from Pastor Hamraad's letter, and this was again necessary in 1848. So, some action was taken. However, in 1852 it was written that the rubble was more dangerous than it was helpful. A commission made a budgetary for the cost to pave the path in 1858. It was estimated that those costs would be around 4,600 guilders in total. It seems like these plans weren't carried out and nothing much had changed, because in 1862 complaints were filed once more by Dr. Holman and twice more in 1864 by Pastor Heuvels of Volendam and Dr. Holman again, who feared he could be accused of culpable homicide if he didn't open his mouth now about the bad condition the path was in. In the 18th century, it had gradually become more easy for Catholics to build their own churches again. So when by 1820 the Catholic population of Volendam had increased quite strongly, expansion of the Holy Nicholas's Church in Edam was to be expected. This first expansion started in 1824 when the main entrance was moved over here to the Voorhaven. It was now not a hidden church anymore. The second large expansion started in 1846 because the Catholic population had grown again. Edam now counted 500 parishioners and Volendam counted 1,000. Here started the fight for the right of Volendam to build their own church. They pleaded for their own church, but this was rejected. The old church in the Voorhaven was largely broken down, and in 1847 this church was built, the Holy Nicholas's Church in Edam. Doesn't it seem reasonable that Volendam wanted its own church? They formed 2/3 of the parishioners after all. I would say yes, but the parish of Edam said no. If 2/3 of their parishioners would leave, you see, that would mean a significant loss of income for the church in Edam. In Volendam, there still is the belief that Edam are cheap and that they've always treated Volendam badly. This may be one of the grounds for that belief. A critical note on this, though, comes from a written conversation between the Bishop of Haarlem and the Minister of Roman Catholic Worship Service from 1858. By this time, Volendam was again refused the right to build their own church, and therefore they felt extremely agitated. They announced to stop attending Mass at the church in Edam, and hundreds gave up their seats out of protest. A small group of Volendammers had visited the minister in July of that year and complained. He took pity on them and promised to support Volendam's proposal, and he would send a letter to the bishop, because after all, it was only in his power to give Volendam a pastor. The bishop was furious by this unexpected support and called it a cowardly deed, saying, "You in The Hague can act big cheaply and let me take all the blows when their witch gets turned down. We can't expect the people of Volendam to be reasonable. The village's development is only in its infancy. Anyway, I don't want to keep having to defend myself, but then the ministry must have to pay a real sum. Perhaps we can get everything ready for 30,000 guilders. If the ministry pays half, I see no further problems." Could Volendam then finally start building their own church? Not quite yet, because the minister's answer was no. He said, "We can't do that. That will cause precedence. With the best will in the world, I can't offer more than 5,000. The bishop seemed happy though, and after some further steps had been taken, he let Volendam and the minister know that preparations for the founding of their own church could start. A commission was formed that would function as the construction commission, and would later serve as a church board. February 21st, 1860, official permission was given. Volendam was now their own separate parish. And so, by taking measures in their own hands, exploiting the bad condition the path to Edam was in, Volendam finally managed to get separated from Edam and found their own church. Between 1848 and 1860, there had been a chapel on this site, especially for the elderly and the ill. The full functioning of this chapel was still made very difficult by the Edam parish, and Volendam felt that they were being easily shoved up with it. And despite the overjoyed exclamations of Pastor Hamraad in the Catholic magazine in 1848, the people of Volendam didn't support this chapel. They wanted a church, and in 1860 they finally succeeded in that. That is when St. Vincent's Church was built.